Good morning. If you are reading along in a hard copy book or online, this seems to be page 73. It's the part of the story where Alec Bing is describing the city of reality. And we'll pick it up there. Milo says, "I don't see any city," said Milo very softly. "Neither do they," Alec remarked sadly, "but it hardly matters, for they don't miss it at all. It must be very difficult to live in a city you can't see," Milo insisted, jumping aside as a line of cars and trucks went by. "Not at all, once you get used to it," said Alec. "But let me tell you how it happened." And as they strode along the bustling and busy avenue, I want to pause and just imagine if these guys were walking with their heads down holding iPhones. That's what it reminds me of. But let me tell you how it happened. And as they strode along the bustling and busy avenue, he began. "Many years ago, on this very spot, there was a beautiful city of fine houses and inviting spaces, and no one who lived there was ever in a hurry. The streets were full of wonderful things to see, and the people would often stop to look at them." "Didn't they have any place to go?" asked Milo. "To be sure," continued Alec. "But as you know, the most important reason for going from one place to another is to see what's in between. And they took great pleasure in doing just that. Then one day, someone discovered that if you walk as fast as possible and look at nothing but your shoes, you would arrive at your destination much more quickly. Soon everyone was doing it. They all rushed down the avenues and hurried along the boulevards, seeing nothing of the wonders and beauty of their city as they went." Milo remembered the many times he'd done the very same thing. And as hard as he tried, there were even things on his own street that he couldn't remember. No one paid any attention to how things looked, and they moved faster and faster. Everything grew uglier and dirtier, and everything grew uglier and dirtier. As everything grew uglier and dirtier, they moved faster and faster. And at last, a very strange thing began to happen. Because nobody cared, the city slowly began to disappear. Day by day, the buildings grew fainter and fainter, and the streets faded away until at last it was entirely invisible. There was nothing to see at all. "What did they do?" the humbug inquired, suddenly taking an interest in things. "Nothing at all," continued Alec. "They went right on living here, just as they'd always done, in the houses they could no longer see, and on the streets which had vanished because nobody had noticed a thing. And that's the way they have lived to this very day." "Hasn't anyone told them?" asked Milo. "It doesn't do any good," replied Milo, "for they can never see what they're in too much of a hurry to look for." "Why don't they live in illusions?" suggested the humbug. "It's much prettier." "Many of them do," he answered, walking in the direction of the forest once again. "But it's just as bad to live in a place where what you do see isn't there, as it is to live in one where what you don't see is." "Perhaps someday you can have one city as easy to see as illusions and as hard to forget as reality," Milo remarked. "That will happen only when you bring back rhyme and reason," said Alec, smiling, for he had seen right through Milo's plan. "Now let's hurry, we'll miss the evening concert." They followed him quickly up a flight of steps, which couldn't be seen, and through a door which didn't exist. In a moment they had left reality, which is sometimes a hard thing to tell, and stood in a completely different part of the forest. The sun was dropping slowly from sight, and stripes of purple and orange and crimson and gold piled themselves on top of the distant hills. The last shafts of light waited patiently for a couple of wrens to find their way home, and a couple of anxious stars had already taken their places. I like that personification. "Here we are," cried Alec, and with a sweep of his arms, he pointed towards an enormous symphony orchestra. "Isn't it a grand sight?" Look at this orchestra. This is great. Having played in an orchestra, I can tell you it does feel that crowded. There were at least 1,000 musicians ranged in a great arc before them. To the left and right there were the violins and cellos, whose bows moved in great waves, and behind them a numberless profusion, piccolos, flutes, clarinets, and oboes, bassoons, horns, trumpets, trombones, and tubas were all playing at once. At the very rear, so far away that they could hardly be seen, were the percussion instruments, and lastly, in a long line up one of the steep slope, side of a steep slope, were the solemn bass fiddles. On a high podium in front stood the conductor, a tall, gaunt man with dark, deep-set eyes and a thin mouth placed carelessly between his long pointed nose and his long pointed chin. He used no baton, but conducted with large, sweeping movements which seemed to start at his toes and work slowly up through his body and along his slender arms, and end finally at the tips of his graceful fingers. "I don't hear any music," said Milo. "That's right," said Alec. "You don't listen to this concert, you watch it. Now pay attention." As the conductor waved his arms, he molded the air like handfuls of soft clay, and the musicians carefully followed his every direction. "What are they playing?" asked Tock, looking up inquisitively at Alec. "The sunset, of course. They play this every evening about this time." That's where we will end this part of the story, where they see the symphony orchestra with this conductor here about to play the sunset.